the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not peace silence. The kind that hums through concrete, thicker than air, heavier than guilt. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev had been called many things since 2013, but here, at ADX Florence, none of them mattered. Labels don't echo in a place built to erase men. ADX, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The most secure prison in America. A fortress of steel and stone buried in the Colorado desert, where the nation's most feared inmates vanish from public memory. Terrorists. Spies. Killers. They call it a clean version of hell. Inside its walls, every sound is measured: footsteps, metal doors, a guard's cough. Inmates spend 23 hours a day locked in concrete boxes no bigger than a parking space. They eat alone. Shower alone. Think alone. And if they talk to anyone, it's usually through the cracks in the vents, desperate whispers carried by recycled air. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. When Dzhokhar arrived, the media storm was still fresh. The nation still saw him as a face of evil, a teenager who had turned a city marathon into a battlefield. But in here, notoriety doesn't buy power, it buys isolation. The staff called it administrative control. Inmates called it buried alive. His cell sat deep in the special security unit, a corridor so quiet that the only movement came from cameras pivoting overhead. The lights never fully turned off. The temperature was kept cold, deliberately, to remind you that comfort was a privilege you'd lost forever. Inmates nearby included men whose names once shook the world: Ramzi Youssef, the first World Trade Center bomber; Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber; Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. But none of them saw each other. Communication wasn't forbidden, it was impossible. The architecture itself was the warden's weapon. Over time, Tsarnaev's days bled together. Prayer. Meal tray. Silence. The pattern repeated until the difference between morning and midnight blurred. Psychologists called it sensory deprivation. Guards called it control. But some officers said it did something else: it hollowed people out. One former staffer said that inmates in that wing sometimes started speaking to themselves, not from madness, but to remember what a voice sounded like. Others refused to eat, letting their hunger become their rebellion. For months, Dzhokhar wrote letters, quotes, verses. Most never left the cell. Some did, heavily redacted by prison censors. But a few that reached the outside world showed something stranger: not defiance, not remorse, just emptiness. As if he was still trying to understand which version of himself survived the blast and which one didn't. The guards didn't speak to him unless required. Orders came from behind bulletproof glass, commands filtered through speakers. Everything was protocol, not contact. Yet rumors began to ripple through the staff, a small act of defiance from inside the silence. It started with an envelope. A letter addressed to a journalist in New England, postmarked from Florence, Colorado. Its tone was calm, reflective, but the question it posed was not. How does a man prove he's changed when no one will ever see him again? The prison launched an investigation. Mail was screened. Cells were searched. And somewhere down that sterile corridor, an inmate with no access to the outside world was quietly accused of doing the impossible. Reaching beyond the walls. The warden's office went dark that night, the sound of the heavy door echoing down the corridor. For the first time in years, staff whispered that someone, or something, inside the world's most secure prison had found a way to speak. And the question that followed was colder than the cell walls themselves. If the Boston bomber could still make his voice heard, what else might he have sent into the world? No one at ADX Florence ever admits to fear. Not the guards. Not the wardens. Not the inmates. Fear is weakness, and weakness spreads faster than rumor. But the morning after that letter surfaced, fear took on a shape, a quiet panic that moved through the corridors like a ghost no one wanted to name. The mail logs didn't match. The outgoing correspondence from Tsarnaev's unit had been cleared, screened, sealed. Every word was photographed, archived, and monitored. Nothing unauthorized could leave. Yet there it was, a letter in the world. Signed. Real. The administration called it an anomaly. The officers called it impossible. But the men who had worked those corridors long enough to know better had another word for it: message. If Tsarnaev had found a way to communicate beyond the system, it meant one of two things: either the rules of ADX weren't as airtight as the government claimed, or someone on the inside had helped him break them. That rumor spread like static, through vent grates, cafeteria whispers, and staff lounges where silence was supposed to be policy. Some said a sympathetic guard had smuggled the letter. Others believed it was a test, a government ploy to bait prisoners into exposing networks they weren't supposed to have. Whatever the truth, something shifted. Within days, Tsarnaev's wing went on what the Bureau called heightened isolation protocol. It sounded clinical, but the inmates knew what it meant: no books, no mail, no radio, no yard time. The silence deepened until it became almost physical, pressing against the ears, the chest, the skull. One guard, a veteran officer named Milton, said later that the prisoners' eyes changed during those lockdowns. "It's not madness," he said. "It's memory fading. Like they're forgetting what people look like." But it wasn't just the inmates breaking under pressure. The staff started fracturing too. Some had nightmares, seeing faces in the security monitors, hearing voices in the ducts. Others requested transfers to lower security facilities. They said the isolation wasn't just for the prisoners anymore. Meanwhile, another letter appeared. This one wasn't mailed. It was found inside the warden's interoffice envelope tray, and signed, unmarked, typed on prison stationery. Only one line stood out: "Isolation doesn't silence truth. It distills it." The Bureau sent investigators. Agents combed through every inch of Tsarnaev's cell, dismantled vents, tore through mattresses, inspected seams of the uniform stitching. They found nothing. No contraband. No tools. No hidden messages. But when they left, one officer noticed something strange. On the underside of Tsarnaev's bunk, faintly scratched into the paint, was a single word: remember. For most inmates, the word might have meant nothing. But for those who had seen what isolation does, it carried weight. Remember what? The act? The victims? The brother he'd lost in the manhunt? Or was it something else, a reminder to himself not to vanish entirely? Days turned into weeks. The investigation froze. The letters stopped. But the silence didn't feel the same. Guards began to notice subtle things: pencil marks shifting on walls, faint sounds in the ventilation at night, coded patterns in meal requests. Psychologists said inmates were known to develop microcommunications, secret signals built from repetition. The Bureau ignored it, calling them coping behaviors. But the staff on that floor started keeping count anyway. 3 knocks on a vent. 2 taps on a tray. 1 pause before lights out. A pattern forming from isolation. A rhythm pulsing under the surface of the world's quietest prison. And then came the report that no one wanted to write. An officer making his rounds near 2 a.m. stopped outside Tsarnaev's cell. Inside, the prisoner was awake, staring at the camera. He spoke one sentence, low, deliberate, meant to be heard. "You can lock the body," he said, "but you can't quarantine an idea." The audio logs confirmed it. The phrase had been recorded, documented, and sent up the chain. But when investigators replayed the tape, the timestamp showed something impossible: the system hadn't been recording at all. The file shouldn't exist. And yet, somehow, it did. By the time winter hit the Rockies, the incident report had been buried under bureaucratic silence. The Bureau issued no statement. The guards were ordered not to speak. And Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was moved, deeper into the prison, into what the staff called the tombs. A corridor so restricted that even other officers needed written clearance to walk past it. The transfer file was 1 page long. No reason listed. No explanation. Just a date, a signature, and a new cell number. But those who'd worked at ADX long enough knew what it meant, a man being erased from the system, piece by piece. They called it administrative vanishing. In that new cell, no books were allowed. No letters. No writing utensils. Only a Bible, a Quran, and a bed bolted to the floor. The lights dimmed but never went out. The temperature dropped to 55 degrees. Guards said they could see their breath when they opened the door. For most inmates, that's where the story ends, drowned in silence. But what happened next refused to stay buried. Months later, a journalist from Boston received another letter. No stamp. No signature. Just a printed note slipped into her mailbox like a ghost from the past. Its message was short, written in the same clipped rhythm as before: "You can't bury truth under concrete." She brought it to federal authorities. They dismissed it as a hoax. But one analyst compared the phrasing, syntax, and punctuation to the first letter, and the match was 97%. How could a man who hadn't seen sunlight in years still reach the outside world? The answer didn't come from the Bureau. It came from inside. A former ADX psychologist, who later resigned under ethical conflict, spoke anonymously. She said that during her sessions, Tsarnaev was calm, unnervingly calm. He said little, but what he did say lingered. People only remember the violence, not the silence that created it. She believed he was using silence as protest, not against his sentence, but against the system itself. That by enduring it, by refusing to break, he was turning the prison into the message. In her notes, she wrote something the Bureau later redacted: "His rebellion isn't action. It's endurance. Every second he stays sane in here, he proves that isolation can't erase identity." Soon after, she was reassigned. But the pattern continued. Reports surfaced that short, cryptic messages, each echoing the same tone, were appearing online. Forums. Anonymous blogs. Even comment sections of news articles about prison reform. Some quoted the same phrases found in the letters: "Isolation doesn't silence truth. It distills it." The FBI traced accounts, searched IPs, issued subpoenas, nothing. Each message vanished within hours. It was as if someone, or something, wanted the words to spread but not to be caught. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. Activists started citing the Florence letters as a symbol of the human mind's refusal to be crushed. Not as sympathy for the man, but as evidence that even in the darkest cell on earth, thought itself can't be imprisoned. In Boston, victims' families called it manipulation, a cruel attempt to recast guilt as philosophy. And they weren't wrong to feel that way. Because truth in this story isn't simple. It's divided, like the man himself. To some, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is a terrorist, a murderer beyond redemption. To others, he's a mirror, reflecting how far a system will go to control the very essence of a person. But the lesson buried in those walls isn't about him. It's about the architecture of silence, and how it sometimes breeds the very rebellion it's meant to contain. At ADX Florence, men live without sound, touch, or freedom. Yet somehow, the most dangerous thing that ever escaped those walls wasn't a person. It was an idea. An idea that survived the cold, the concrete, and the years, whispering through locked doors that even the most secure prison in America can't keep a story from being told. Because when the walls stop listening, the silence starts to speak. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.